everybody, very, very warm welcome to you all to the Innovation Warehouse. There's actually a lot of new faces this time. We are TechMeetups. We usually run events for people purely in the startup community, and I know there's people who've come from outside that community here tonight because we have a very special presentation actually for anyone that's interested in large companies, in small companies, about how to make them work better. So I think it's going to be a great evening. We have Horace Dediu from Asimco also listening in at the moment, and he'll be joining us later. Now Adam Lashinsky is obviously here, and Adam, I'll leave you to introduce yourself. But what I will say is after this talk, Adam will be outside signing books. And I'm not sure whether any of you had a chance to actually read it, but over the past few days, I had a really good time, to actually look through things, to really familiarize myself, and you've really made me question a lot of things that I do when I manage people. It's been really eye-opening for me, so I really recommend it as a read, and actually to question what it is you do from day to day. What struck me is just how meticulous people can be when they plan even the smallest things. So I'll just switch off this projector, and Adam's going to do a talk to you about Apple, world's biggest startup, and then take some questions from the audience.
Very good. Thank you, Olga. Thank you, and good evening. And I find that everybody has an opinion about Apple, and so I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions and answering them as best I can. I want to start with a caveat, which is to say that I understand completely that Apple is not a startup. It would be incredibly naive to think that it is. And I referred to Apple as being the world's biggest startup in an article I did in Fortune magazine in May of last year, which led to this book. And I was approached by an executive who was about to leave the company who said, now, we're not a startup. It's a very big bureaucratic organization. And I said, yes, I understand, but what I'm trying to explain are the ways that this giant organization behaves like a startup and the ways that Apple strains to emulate a startup. And he said, well, yeah, that's fair. That's absolutely true. So let me just share with you a few of those ways. Apple is, at last count, some 27,000 non-retail employees, and more than double that when you include all of their retail employees. But what the company does is tries to have to put as many small groups together as possible, in particular when it's working on something that's important. So for an anecdote that I share in the book, for example, is that basically 2 software engineers worked on the iOS version of Safari. Now, obviously more people got involved at some point, but for the initial phase it was just 2. Please, if you want to come in. Good to see you. No, informal girl. It's easier for you to walk across than it is for me to have somebody looking at somebody in the doorway. So I'm jumping ahead, but this is not a Steve Jobs keynote. This is an Adam Lashinsky chat with a piece of paper in his hand instead. So where was I? On the subject of small groups. Over and over, I had Apple people explain to me that Apple, when you're inside, it feels like you're resource constrained. And I said, how can that possibly be? The company's got $100 billion in cash. How could you be resource constrained? And they would say, well, Apple staffs things only up to the point that they need to be staffed, and it tries very hard not to throw a bunch of people at something just because they can. And I would query people about this over and over and say, you can't be serious that Apple will only have a few people and it will feel like it doesn't have the resources to get something done. And they would say, yeah, it's strange, but it's absolutely true. This is how the company does it. Now, whether or not this is the way a startup behaves or needs to behave, Apple's incredibly secretive. And it's a major part of my book, and I just want to talk about it for a second because it's really in direct contrast with how Silicon Valley works, and even how something like a group like this works. Someone asked me earlier, how would Steve Jobs have felt about coming to Shoreditch and trading ideas with peers? And the answer is he wouldn't have thought very highly of it at all, because Apple doesn't share. And in the Valley, engineers share all the time. It's a hallmark of being part of the Valley experience, that you get together in bars or in organizations like the Churchill Club, and you talk about what you're doing. Software engineers in particular in the Valley like to talk about what they're doing, not Apple engineers. And in the book I talk about someone I know who plays in a regular poker game with a team of Apple engineers. And he said to me, when the subject of Apple comes up at the poker table, the subject is changed. You don't talk about Apple, period. But the fascinating thing about Apple is not just keeping secrets from outsiders, but keeping secrets internally. Apple people don't share information with each other. It's a very strange and counterintuitive part of the company's culture. You work on what you're assigned to work on and nothing else. Now, you said, Olga, that you found aspects of what I wrote making you question the way that you work and the way you do business. I found it extremely humbling when I began to understand that Apple is not a multitasking culture. I do 17 things at once, and the drawbacks, the downsides of multitasking are obvious. It's hard to do one thing well when you're doing 17 things. Apple people tend to do one thing well. They take this to great lengths, however, and I think there are applications to a startup. They have a culture of something that they refer to as disclosure. You're not entitled to know something unless you're disclosed on it at Apple. And so people will begin meetings by trying to suss out, well, are you disclosed on this? And if you don't know what it is that you're disclosed on, that's a sure sign that you weren't disclosed on it, and you'll be asked to leave. And they go through this elaborate kabuki of trying to figure out that they're only speaking to people who they're supposed to be speaking to. It's the exact analog in the intelligence world to finding out if someone has clearance, a top secret clearance or an ultra top secret clearance. And at Apple, most people don't have it. I talk about in the book how you need a security badge to go almost anywhere in Apple. And the surprising thing is that your badge doesn't work everywhere. So at most companies, including mine, if you have a badge, you can get through the security in all the places where you need to get through security. At Apple, your badge won't get you everywhere. Please come in. These are my sisters. And they'll pay for this. The surprising thing I heard more than once is that not only does your badge not get you everywhere at Apple, but you may have access to places that your boss doesn't have access to. Incredibly secretive organization. Jobs like to complain or like to brag, rather, that Apple had no committees. Every big company has a committee for this or that, and Apple didn't. I talked to employees who told me that wasn't completely true. There was an international pricing committee. There's a brand guidelines committee. Unclear if Steve Jobs knew this. He didn't know everything that happened at the company. But his point was, and this is directly applicable to a startup, is that he wanted Apple to think with one voice. He didn't want Apple to be divided into fiefdoms. He wanted there to be one brand. And what he literally did was ensure that there was only one P&L, only one profit and loss statement for the entire company. He didn't want to have this notion of a general manager who was responsible for a piece of business. Pieces of business is something that managers brag about. I have a P&L, I'm important. I have my own advertising budget, my own marketing budget, and so on. It makes that person feel important, but it isn't necessarily what's best for the company. And so Jobs said only one person's going to control the P&L, and that's the CFO of Apple, and he's going to report to me on it. Apple is unlike any big company in that it's highly functional. People work on one thing, they're valued for their expertise, and they do that for the entire company. My favorite example of that is that people who run Apple's website and the people who run Apple's retail stores don't choose the images, the photographic images that go on the site or go in the stores. The people who do graphic arts for Apple choose the images. And if you need photos, you go to them for it. You don't hire out your own team to do your own. This is replicated throughout the entire company. It's strange in the corporate world as well, in that Apple doesn't promote this notion that you should be exposed to all different parts of the company or all different parts of the world. They don't think in terms of broadening their people. This would be a very General Electric approach. Would be, well, you've done medical, now it's time to do plastics, and after that it's time to do locomotives, and now you'll be a well-rounded executive. Apple thinks much more like a startup. They don't care about well-rounded executives. They care about people who are the best that they can be in the world at what they do. It's worked extremely well for them. And in that light, they take hiring very seriously. So all startups take hiring seriously too. If you're only going to have 17 people at the startup, you're going to make sure that each one is, number one, extremely good, and number two is well matched for the culture of the company. And the culture of the company is obviously, it's incredibly important to a startup. It's incredibly important at Apple. I've described Apple as a very difficult place to work, almost a brutal workplace with long hours, high demands from senior management. But it's the kind of place where people actually stay for a very long time. They either wash out quickly or they catch on and they stay. I quote an executive in the book who said that Jobs liked to say that A-listers hire other A-listers, and B-listers tend to hire C-listers or C players, and we only want A players here at Apple. I think another aspect that Apple has, at least for the past 15 years, behaved like a startup, is that it has had a micromanager as CEO. And this goes against the rules of running a big company, of managing a big company. Big companies, especially the size of Apple, with 27,000 employees, most of whom, by the way, most of whom are in California and are in Cupertino itself. For the CEO to get into the details of what everybody is doing at a company that size is almost unheard of. It's far more like what a startup CEO would do, and wanting to be sure to approve everything. Please come in. And I have an anecdote in the book about the person whose job it was to write an email that would go out coincidentally with or simultaneously with a product being released at a keynote address at the Moscone Center in San Francisco. And this person was explaining to me his job was to write the email, and several days before the release he would send it to Steve Jobs for his approval. And Jobs would go back and forth with multiple iterations. And he said to me, sometimes the argument would come down to an argument over commas or semicolons. And I'm listening to this story with my mouth open. Like, how could the CEO of Apple possibly be concerned about semicolons and periods and commas in a press release? And I think, again, this is something of a Rorschach test to how you feel about management and leadership and the way Jobs operated Apple and the way Apple operates. You could have the opinion that this is a ludicrous waste of time, or you could have the opinion that the CEO is showing that there is no detail that is beneath his approval, and that's exactly how a startup leader or an entrepreneur should behave. I think most executives at big companies could never do this, and it shows. It shows the difference between Apple's attention to detail and other companies' attentions to detail. There's no excuse for a startup, though, to not have an attention to detail, because a startup typically is only doing one thing. One of the unusual characteristics of Apple, again, under Jobs' leadership, has been that for a company its size, it has shockingly few products. You sort of know this, but you know this intuitively. But when you stop and think about it, it's sort of alarming. When Jobs came back, Apple in 1997, Apple was doing all sorts of things. It made the Newton handheld organizer. It made its own printers, and so on. And he came in and said, right, we're going to cut all this out, and we're going to make 2 desktops and 2 laptops. And then we're going to make a beautiful Macintosh. We're going to call it the iMac. And only then, it was several years later when iTunes and the iPod came around, and then around the same time they started to build stores to sell these things. But because Apple doesn't do many things at once, again, like a startup, Jobs and his executive team had the ability to pay very careful attention to everything that the company was doing. So the hallmark of Jobs' management of the company was a product review every single week. And so there'd be a meeting on Monday where the senior executives managing the development of a given product would come and present that to Jobs and his relatively small executive team, typically about 10 people, and anyone else that he would invite into the meeting who he felt ought to be exposed to what was happening on that product. And it's interesting. He would be very specific about who he wanted in the meeting, for which part of the meeting, and he would inform that person when they were excused and they could leave the meeting. And if you were doing particularly well in Steve Jobs' world at that time, you might ask to stay a little longer at the meeting. Eventually, you'd be told when it was time to leave, however. Every product that's in the Apple pipeline will be reviewed, if not at one meeting, then the following week's meeting. So that by the week after that, the product that was reviewed the previous week will be reviewed again. And so there's this rhythm of everything that's under development at the company being reviewed no less than every 2 weeks by the senior management. Junior level engineers have told me that what they took from this was that they knew that no matter what, their products would be reviewed fairly quickly by senior management. And again, you can imagine big companies that might have some sort of quarterly offsite for senior management to be briefed on what's going on at the company. That would never be a problem at Apple. There's also it's a presentation-oriented company. So junior people are constantly in the mode of preparing their boss for a presentation to their boss for a presentation to the CEO. And it's the same way with keynotes. There's this sense, there was always this sense when Steve Jobs got up to do a keynote that it was very casual. He'd step forward and take a sip from his bottle of water and then sort of talk about a few things that he would show. Nothing could be further from the truth. It was all planned out very meticulously, down to the words that he said. And there was this elaborate process of preparing a presentation for somebody who would work on it more, until it would be presented to Steve. That include outsiders, by the way. People, the partners who would be, and you've all seen in an Apple keynote, a partner who would do a presentation, who does a presentation at an Apple event, would be asked to come in and make a presentation to a mid-level executive. And once they cleared that, they would make it to a more senior executive. And when they cleared that, they would make their presentation to Steve Jobs, who might say to them, "That's crap, we're not going to do that in our keynote." Or might say, "Okay, that's good, I think you should work on a few things." But they practice and they hone over and over and over, and the people who are in positions of authority know exactly what's going on, of everything, not just one piece. And I think that's something that makes Apple more like a startup than the giant corporation that it is. A few other things before I take your questions. It was shocking to me to realize what a headquarters-centric company Apple is. So compared with some of its peers, which have operations around the world and important regional offices in various parts of the United States and outside the United States, everything that matters at Apple happens in Cupertino, California. meetings happen face to face so that people can look each other in the eyes and argue with each other, and they argue passionately and even violently about what's important. But it's not a teleconference or a video conference culture. It's a face-to-face meeting culture in Cupertino. Now, of course, a lot happens at their factories in China, and senior people do travel to the factories in China, but they will bring the prototypes back with them and show them in Cupertino and discuss them in Cupertino. In anticipation of a question about, well, what about important centers of entrepreneurial excellence, like Boston in the United States, or Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, or Shoreditch in London, Jobs would have said, yeah, that was for your benefit. I don't know how this will go going forward, but Jobs was completely uninterested in those places and unimpressed. He effectively closed down more than one startup when he bought it. He said, well, one of the conditions was you, the founder, and your people are going to have to move to California. And it's not a bad trade, so most people take him up on the offer. But part of it is he's a true believer in Silicon Valley, and I could talk more about that, but also because he wanted people in the line of fire where they could come have a meeting. One interesting characteristic of Apple that makes it so different from others is, and this is where people suggest that it's kind of cultish, is that when you join Apple, you're joining Apple, and you're expected to check your own professional identity at the door. You're not allowed to have an ego at Apple. You're not allowed to have a profile, a public profile at Apple. So you don't see Apple people going around speaking at conferences. You don't see them publishing articles in trade journals or giving interviews in the press about things that are of interest to them. You don't see, until very recently, even senior Apple people sitting on the boards of directors of other companies. And Jobs' attitude toward this was, we've got a lot of work to do here, and we can barely get it done with the time that we've got in the day. Why would you possibly think that you have time to be on somebody else's board of directors? It makes pretty good common sense, but we all probably know examples of people who spend plenty of their time working on other activities because it's of interest to them, it's broadening to them. Again, Apple doesn't care what's broadening to you, because the shareholders probably don't care either. They expect you to be doing what's best for Apple all the time. And then I'll just talk about one last characteristic of Apple that's somewhat unique, and I think is one other way that Apple tries to capture the startup vibe, which is this Top 100 meeting that Jobs held once a year or so when he was healthy. And the Top 100 is this super secretive offsite, typically at one or two different resorts about 100 miles south of San Francisco, or south of Cupertino rather, where Jobs would gather everybody that he considered to be the most important people in the company, the 100 or so most important people. And not necessarily by rank. Just because you were at a certain level didn't mean that you were going to be invited to a top 100. At the top 100, Jobs would give his vision for the company. Other executives would present products that they were working on. Important products and initiatives would be revealed at a top 100 for the senior management for the first time. Things like the Apple stores or the iPod. Most recently, at the last Top 100 that Jobs did, the iPad 2 with its magnetic cover was shown for the first time. Jobs was as paranoid about secrecy at these Top 100s as he was about secrecy every other time. In the book I discuss, at the last one, he was so concerned that somebody would try to steal the secrets from what was happening at the Top 100 that he wouldn't let anybody talk while the food servers were moving about the room or taking drinks or plates out of the room. He would say, okay, we need to wait until all of them walk out of the room. He also made sure to sweep the room for bugs. Paranoid perhaps, but when you're talking about an enterprise that's the most valuable company in the world and all you really have are your trade secrets, then I think it explains how secretive he was. So I've tried to talk as much about how Apple in its own way emulates or tries to mimic the startup vibe. There's a lot more I could talk about, so I'm happy to address what you'd like. So please. Yes?
Yeah, can I just point out, they're not Apple's factories in China, they belong to Foxconn.
Absolutely
Apple,
right.
Apple are taking a beating for the conditions there, but it's Foxconn, a nice Taiwanese company, I hasten to add.
Yeah, absolutely right. I definitely misspoke. It was shorthand to refer to them as their factories. These are factories that they contract for. Might as well be theirs for the way they control them and tell their manufacturers how to do the manufacturing. But and for the beating that they're taking, they might as well be theirs. But you're quite right; they're not theirs. Yes.
You spoke a lot about how cutthroat and competitive Apple is, and obviously that works quite well. Then you also said that a lot of the employees stay for quite a while. So I was wondering, perhaps you could reveal, or perhaps there is nothing to reveal, sort of the positive culture that would perhaps have the employee retention at a higher rate than at other companies. Is it just that you want to be on the winning team, or is there any other factor?
Well, a few things. And this tends to, I think it's perilous to try to overgeneralize about Apple employees, because there's different kinds of Apple employees, just the way there's different kinds of people in any organization, large or small. You will frequently hear about Apple engineers who will say things like, ever since I got my first Apple IIe in junior high school, I dreamed about working at Apple. Those people are very happy at Apple and probably out of the line of fire of some of the harsher elements of being at Apple. These are people who aren't expecting to ever rise into positions of leadership, and they're in hog heaven working at Apple. And then there are these trade-offs that people are willing to make depending on which part of the company you're in. There's no higher accolade than having Apple on your resume. And so, I think the short answer is you're having a professional experience that you'll never have again. And so for some people, that's certainly worth it. There's a joke that I repeat in the book that people out on the outside want in and people on the inside want out. For a period, I was trying to understand this question of the culture, and I would ask the happiness question or the fun question. Do people have fun at Apple? And the typical response was, to avoid my question, they'd say, people at Apple have a sense of mission, and if they stick around, they buy into that sense of mission, and that's very satisfying. And I can respect that. I view it in non-judgmental terms. Yes.
So given those points around how Apple works, do you think there's any place for that level of autocracy in a startup? So for all the great things they do, being very focused, obviously people are getting almost to the point of bullied in that environment. Do you think there's any place for that kind of management style within a startup?
Is there room for that kind of management style?
Yeah, of that kind of one single focusedness of one person in the company.
Well, in a lot of ways, I think it would be easier for a startup than for a big company. By the way, I may be naive about this. I think you can be dictatorial without being unpleasant. I think it's possible. And I think we'll see examples of that. This is for a variety of reasons. Because Jobs' senior management team stayed with him for so long, he had this charisma that he commanded loyalty, and people were terrified, I think, they would leave eventually, but they typically wouldn't do anything else. There was a long stretch where they were either exhausted or scared to go into competition. That there is very few examples of senior Apple people who went on to do something else, and those that did typically failed. But we will see more examples of people who are either former Apple people or people who love and admire Apple, who will try to take the best of it. So, for example, I talk in the book about Mike McHugh, who's the CEO of Flipboard, who's a repeat entrepreneur, never worked at Apple, but is an absolute Apple worshiper. And I asked him, well, what do you take from Apple? And he said, I take, and Mike's an extremely nice guy, and I think not just to me, I think he has a reputation in his company of being a nice guy. And he said, well, we try to only do one thing at a time. So for the first year of their company's existence, they only developed an iPad app. They only recently introduced their iPhone app. They easily could have done an Android app at the same time or done a web app at the same time. But he said to me, we didn't, and this is why. But, I think, again, maybe you'll disagree. I think every startup wants a dictatorial focus and vision because, time and money are of the essence. You don't have time to go, or the resources to go trying a whole bunch of different things. Yeah.
How important was or is Jonathan Ive in the whole sort of thing, given that you said a lot of people don't have a profile and whatnot?
So he, first of all, very important, and I think he's an exception in the sense that it's been well reported that he and Jobs were personally close. I've considered Jobs to be a mentor, a friend. Jobs, I think, considered him to be a soulmate. If you listen to some of the things that he said, arguably more so than his wife. And I've heard these wonderful stories of the two of them sitting at lunch together and not saying anything. They're just going like that. And so I think that just the fact that Johnny Ive is famous and well known and highly regarded is a testament to the fact that Jobs made an exception for him. And now, which hasn't changed the fact that Ive rarely speaks in public and rarely gives interviews. From everything I've heard, that may just suit him nicely because he's not the most extroverted person to begin with. But he was also following the Apple script and doing things the way Apple would demand that an executive do. But is he critical? I mean, he's absolutely critical. Having said that, and I think I know there were a lot of rumors in the British press that his departure was imminent because he bought a beautiful home in England. And I think that someone quoted him saying that he wanted his children to go to school in England. But I would not be at all surprised if he promised Jobs that he was going to stick around for a while. We'll never know unless, I doubt he'll give an interview on the subject, but it wouldn't surprise me. It's also worth noting, that he has this relatively small, again, team of people working for him, each of whom is a rock star in the industrial design world. In the design world, especially in San Francisco, these people are relatively well known. I don't know any of them, but common sense would suggest to me that there's one or two of them who've been working for Ive for 10 years could step in if necessary. But is he critical? Absolutely, he's critical. Yeah. Yes, I'm sorry for neglecting this side of the room.
What's the one thing a startup should take from Apple to create a better business, and what's the one thing a grown-up or a proper big company could do to emulate?
Well, I could easily give you the answer. It's the same thing, but I'll give you two. So the one thing that a startup can take, and I think Jobs would have given this advice, which is pick the one thing that you think you are particularly good at and do that. And don't do all the other things, because you're not going to be any good at them. And you're going to be spread too thin if you try to do the other things. So that's the one thing that I think he would have advised the startup. The one thing that I think that big companies can emulate Apple on more is to figure out what your message is that you want to communicate to the public and be a whole lot more focused and disciplined about communicating it.
Isn't a lot of that tied up in, Apple's got a very unique culture, you talked about that. It's quite a well-known thing, trying to see something like that happening in a GE or a Microsoft or any of those types of organizations. They can be very focused, but that secrecy, a whole bunch of the things that Apple is admired for, other companies are absolutely slated for.
And that's what I think they could try harder at. And it's no excuse that just because they don't have the same culture as Apple, that they shouldn't try. I'll give you an example. I have a section where I quote a former product marketing executive who was authorized to speak on the iPhone. Now, just right there, most companies have far too many people speaking. And again, you understand why the executives want to speak. It's good for their careers. It's good for their next job to be speaking now. It's hard to understand why you'd want too many people speaking from the company's perspective. And every company does media training. Every company teaches its people, this is how you speak to the press. Apple just does it better. They script it, they script the exact words, and they teach their people, you don't deviate from the script. As much as a journalist wouldn't like that and doesn't like it, I think that's something that most companies could do a better job with.
Is that very dependent on Steve Jobs, on a new CEO? How will that change?
I think I'll give you two answers. I think it's ingrained in the culture of the company. And I think there's no way they'll be as good at it after, with him gone. Julian.
What was it that happened that made the company move from this culture of openness to the culture of secrecy?
You know, you stump me a little bit in that I'm not a student of the late 70s or the 80s or even the early 90s, and I also don't know that Apple ever would have been known for its openness. In fact, even before the 97 period, Apple made the decision not to license or to stop licensing its operating system to clone manufacturers. But you will see if you're a careful student of the clips from the early years that Jobs was far chattier when he was younger. He would go do press interviews far more than he did when he was older, and he was far less targeted about it. So it would be a mistake for startups to say, oh, well, I should only give one interview a year. That would be preposterous. And he came to it over time. Yeah.
You know, a few years ago there was a lot of reports about Apple hiring a professor from MIT, business professor, to study Apple management.
Yeah.
And establishing Apple University.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about that?
I do. It was Yale. I don't know about an MIT professor, although it may have happened. So in 2008, Jobs hired the dean of the Yale School of Management named Joel Podolny, who had been a young and controversial professor at Stanford and Harvard, and then the dean at Yale. And Podolny was a very public figure when he was a university professor, and he went to Apple and promptly disappeared. He doesn't talk to anybody. He hasn't made a public comment. By the way, he subsequently became the vice president of human resources, despite never having had a human resources job in his life, or any sort of business job in his life. And he set about creating a curriculum where he hired other business school professors, only some of whose identities I know, and they have begun writing case studies of Apple's decision making. And then they'll teach these cases to Apple executives, sometimes using Apple executives as the teachers for the cases. And this was a blatant attempt by Jobs to institutionalize his thought process and the way the company culture had grown up. I refer to it as having been Talmudic. In that he was writing down the contemporary ways of Apple. Some of these professors are also teaching courses inside the company that are not about Apple. So for example, this Harvard professor, Richard Tedlow, who's well known for having been Andy Grove's biographer, has taught a class on A&P, the American supermarket chain, which was once a great company that died. And I assume the message is great companies need to be aware of the pitfalls of becoming former great companies. He also, when he was at Harvard, taught a course on crisis communications around the famous Tylenol bottle tampering incident and how Johnson & Johnson dealt with this crisis of someone having messed with its bottles and customers having died from that. Apple needs crisis communications as well, and he's taught that to them. Yes.
There was one thing that always struck me as interesting, how Apple see their investors really like a thorn in their side.
Yes.
and that's actually something that startups get off the ground. They need the investors, and often you see these guys coming in, and the company loses its values. Now, can startups actually learn from Apple? Should they be more brave when they actually look and talk with their investors?
Well, can everyone hear the question okay about investors? So, I think it would be naive to advise an entrepreneur to tell his or her investor who controls 40 or 60% of the company to, hey, go away. I don't want to answer your question. I'm busy. Which is what Apple does with its investors. It essentially tells them, I'm too busy to talk to you. Apple gives investors minimal attention, about the same amount of attention or less that it gives to journalists. That's something that it began to do over time. It wasn't always quite so arrogant in general, and certainly not to investors. In a way, I talk about a lot of the differences between Google and Apple, and some of them have nothing to do with your question. Google gives away free food. Apple doesn't. Google's a very open, collaborative place. Apple's very closed. One thing Apple shares with Google, however, is when the Google founders wrote their famous founders letter to accompany the IPO, they said, we are going to retain voting control of the company, and we're going to do what we think is best for the long term of the company. And if you don't like that, don't invest. And Apple under Jobs had similar body language, which was, we are really uninterested in your concerns about our quarterly results because we're investing for the long term. So you're welcome to ask about it, but we're not going to answer you. And you're going to have to make your decision about whether or not to invest, and we don't care if you do, because somebody else will. Can a startup entrepreneur be like that? I really don't think so. Or put differently, if you can find willing investors who will give you money and not have any input on how you run the company, go for it.
Okay.
Some investors obviously have a great track record of truly helping their entrepreneurs be long-term focused, but that'd be wonderful to have them. Yeah.
Hey, so you talked a lot about how Steve Jobs kind of thought was this dictator in the way he created this employment environment with Apple. But Steve Jobs also launched and kind of pushed the front scene of a big company, Pixar, in which the work environment is completely different,
Yeah.
completely open, more like Google than Apple. And both companies are incredibly successful. How come did one company take this path and the other one take the other path?
So I haven't studied Pixar, so I don't hold myself up as an expert on Pixar, but my the facts I can tell you is that Jobs never ran the company on a day-to-day basis, even when he was CEO. And Ed Catmull and John Lasseter were critical to the culture of Pixar and to establishing the culture of Pixar. Jobs was not. He was influential in terms of M&A at Pixar, and really getting involved when it was time to knock heads with the movie studios. He learned a ton at Pixar about dealing with Hollywood, by the way, that he later applied at Apple when it was time to do negotiations over with music, television, and movies with iTunes. But I mean, you're right. It's a fascinating difference between Apple and Pixar, two completely different workplaces. And maybe he was running an experiment too, where he was doing them slightly differently. But it's the difference between the degree to which he was hands-on. Yeah.
Have you met John Lasseter? I know that he's obsessed with details.
With detail.
Yes.
Yeah.
So he's sharing with Steve Jobs the same sort of attention to details.
Yeah.
Which is almost obsessive.
I haven't. I read a wonderful book by a guy named David Price called The Pixar Touch, which has great descriptions of how Pixar got going, and in the same way that it's sort of weird today to think of Apple as having been a struggling and much smaller company 15 years ago. Everyone assumes that Pixar got started as a computer-aided animation company to make feature films, and it's completely not true. They actually were trying to make very expensive high-end workstations and selling them, and it didn't work. But they did have this little, they did these first shorts, these first animated shorts, as a way of demonstrating what their computers could do, and that was the germ that led to Pixar. I don't know if, and he made that, and that's something that was Jobs' credit. He did make the decision to shut down the other stuff and focus on that.
How is risk mitigated?
Mitigated.
How does they deal with risk?
Yeah. In a way, it's gotten easier over time because they have these cash cows that they didn't have at the very beginning. So, in the same way that Google has Google AdWords to pay for everything, now Apple has the Macintosh to pay for everything. Macintosh is this incredible cash generating machine. And so, but aside from that, the only factual answer I can give you about how they mitigate risk is that they have a completely unrealistic attitude about cash. They now hold almost $100 billion worth of cash. No business school professor would tell you that it makes any sense to hold on to that kind of cash. But Jobs was obsessed with the day that he knew that the company was a few months away from running out of money. So he didn't like debt, and he wanted to keep as much cash around as possible. So on the one hand, they're taking a risk with every new product. With having so few products is the ultimate risk taking for a big company. They are in a hit-driven business like a movie studio. So they don't mitigate risk in the strategy of the company. They do mitigate it by, my gosh, with $100 billion, they could make mistakes for the next 5 years and not worry about going out of business. Last question.
Sorry. You talk about Apple University or Apple University as a tool to institutionalize Jobs' thinking. With him gone, is there anything in his thinking, ingrained in his thinking, that will progress the success of Apple without something that's continually feeding into that institutionalization of thinking or way of thinking? So is there something about his way of thinking that will help people following that continue being successful?
It's a philosophical question, and it's impossible to answer. I think they're going to have this existential crisis for the foreseeable future, in that, Tim Cook said publicly that one of the last things that Steve Jobs said to him was, when you're faced with a difficult decision, I don't want you to ask, what would I do? And yet, every time they're faced with a critical decision, they're going to say, either quietly or out loud, what would Steve do in this situation? And I think all they can do best is try to let the culture of the company guide them. So I'll give you an example. We've all come to realize how important design is at Apple, and that the design team needs to be involved early, not late. I think there's no way they'll abandon that anytime soon. That doesn't mean they'll make the right design decisions. They may make the wrong design decisions, but they'll let that be their mistake. I don't think they'll say, maybe it's time for us to evolve on this. Maybe the financial people should be more involved in the decisions about making this product than the designers. But he gave them this challenge to think for themselves, and so I assume they'll take him up on it, and it'll be, just as to make a final comment and to put a fine point on your question. In my opinion, Apple just had the most phenomenal 15-year run of any modern company ever. I think that had Jobs remained healthy and lived, there's no way they would have had another 15 years like the last 15 years. They would have somehow screwed it up at some point. Every company does. So, given that he's not around, it's impossible they're going to have another run like the last 15 years, and they will have to evolve. And I'm glad for it, because I think it'll be a hell of a good story. Thank you very much.